Hello, welcome back to this conversation. We're going to jump in talking about what the sources say. We've been looking at verses in the Bible, and we're going to talk about the last few that we have left. So we're going to look at these two verses together because there's a lot of crossover. The first is 1 Timothy 1:10. There's a specific phrase in here that says, "For them that defile themselves with mankind." So that has been interpreted to mean homosexuality. And then in 1 Corinthians 6:9, it says that the righteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then it specifically mentions the effeminate and the abusers of themselves with mankind. And so that has also been interpreted to mean homosexuality. So we're going to look at these verses, but to do so, we're going to look at the actual Greek words themselves that these phrases were translated from and see if that can give us a better understanding of how God actually feels about homosexuality. So the first word we're going to look at is malokai, and then after that, we're going to look at arsenokotai and see if those two words can give us a better understanding. So the first, malakoi, it means the word soft or effeminate. And in the biblical times, it was actually used to describe fine clothing. So it was used to describe fine clothing. It was also used to describe a lack of self control or weakness. And it stems from this belief that women were thought to lack control over their appetites and emotions, whereas men were believed to be models of temperance and reason. I don't know how they came to this conclusion. Had they known any men when they came to this? Like, was the man in the room with them? But this was the belief at the time that women were thought to lack self control and men were models of temperance and reason. And so, if a man was described as being a woman, then it would often mean that he didn't have self control. So, it was actually possible for a man to be described as a woman in his pursuit of women, if that makes sense. So, basically, if a man couldn't control himself or he just became so swoony over a gal that he liked, then he would be described as effeminate because he was acting like women who didn't have any self control. We see different translations of this word throughout time. The first is weaklings, and then wontons, and then debauchers, and then licentious, and then sensual finally. So throughout time, there's been several misunderstandings about what this word actually means. However, in 1990, the Catholic Study Bible, which is known for being heavily conservative, wrote about this verse and said the Greek word translated as boy prostitutes or malokai designated catamites, or boys or young men who were kept for purposes of prostitution, a practice not uncommon in the Greco Roman world. The term translated practicing homosexuals, or arsenokotai, refers to adult males who indulged in homosexual practices with such boys. So, in other words, basically, it's saying that this word Malachi is used to describe male prostitutes and they would engage in these homosexual practices through prostitution. The New International Version of the Bible, which was released in the 1900s, initially translated Malachi as male prostitutes, but then later revised it in 2011 to men who have sex with men. If we look at the word arsenokotai, we can split that word up into its base meanings. So the word arsen means male, and koitz means bed. And so if we put the words together, it means males who bed in a sexual context. And it's only used twice in the Bible. And so the actual meaning of the word is a little unsure because it's hard to totally understand what a word means if we have two words put together. It's kind of like the word understand. We have these two words that are put together, but the two words on their own don't contribute to the meaning of the word when they're put together. You have the word under, which means below, and stand, which means to be on your 2 feet. But when you put them together, it means to comprehend. And so we kind of see the same thing here where we understand that there's the word male and the word bed in a sexual context, but we don't know exactly what that means when they're put together. Um, so, as Dale Martin commented, who's a New Testament scholar, the only reliable way to define a word is to analyze its use in as many different contexts as possible. And so, we're going to look at some of the ways that it shows up outside of the Bible to see if that can give us a better understanding. There was an ancient text called the Sibylline Oracles, and it said, "Do not steal seeds. Whoever takes for himself is a curse to generations of generations to the scattering of life. And do not," this is where the word comes in, "arsenokotai, do not betray information, do not murder, give one who has labored his wages, do not oppress a poor man." So in this list, not one of them is related to sexual behavior, but later in this text, it does denounce sexual vices, and arsenokotai is absent from the list. So why would it not be repeated there if it was understood to be a primarily sexual offense? Next up, there was another text called the Acts of John that was published in the 2nd century. And it says, "Let the murderer know that the punishment he has earned awaits him in double measure after he leaves this world. So also the poisoner, sorcerer, robber, swindler, and arsenokotypes, the thief in all of this band." And this section ends with a declaration that eternal misery and torment await kings, rulers, tyrants, boasters, and warmongers. It also lists sexual sins in a separate section, and arsenokoites doesn't appear there. It only appears among vices involving economic injustice and abuses of power. So, putting some of these texts together, one historian has written, "We shouldn't be surprised to find that both uses of the word in the New Testament place it between sexual and economic vices. In 1 Corinthians 6, that's the verse that we read earlier, if you remember, the word appears following references to sexually immoral and adulterers, and before thieves and the greedy. And in 1 Timothy 1:10, it appears after sexually immoral and before slave traders or man stealers. These contexts support the idea that arsenokotai may actually describe economic exploitation by sexual means. So even though this word has been interpreted to mean homosexuality or relationships between two people of the same gender, in its time, it's actually most likely dealt with prostitution and using money for immoral sexual acts. Throughout time, it's been translated to mean several different things. The first was in 1525. It was translated as abusers of themselves with the mankind. And then it was translated as buggerers, and then the brutal, and then sodomites, and then liars with mankind. What was interesting is that historically, sodomites and buggerers were labels applied on the basis of acts and not desires. So once a person stopped engaging in sodomy or buggery, he was no longer considered a sodomite or a buggerer. But like we talked about with historical context, starting in the mid 20th century, the term started referring to a specific type of person whose sexual orientation made him subject to condemnation. So these verses, while they're mentioning like sodomy or buggerers, that was meant for a specific act and not for an orientation. However, we see that with later translations, as this orientation began to be understood, it was translated to target this orientation or identity. In 1946, homosexuals appears, which is the first time it appears anywhere in the Bible. And then later it was translated to pervert, and then homosexual perverts, and then homosexual offenders, and then finally practicing homosexuals. So this change in translation has fostered the mistaken belief that Paul was condemning a minority group with a different sexual orientation, but instead he was likely condemning excessive and exploitative sexual conduct. Last but not least, we have Jude 1:7, which says, basically in talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, in verse 7, we see that the city gave themselves over to fornication and they started going after strange flesh. This strange flesh is thought to mean homosexuality. We're not going to go into this one super deep because we already talked about Sodom and Gomorrah. So if we don't believe Sodom and Gomorrah condemn homosexuality, then this strange flesh must be alluding to something else. And so just a few things to think about. If this section was relating to homosexuality, wouldn't it say that the people went after the same flesh? If it says strange, then that implies something that's different or foreign, which would make sense if it would make sense if the word was saying same flesh, because if you have two men, then that would be the same. But if it's strange, then that must be alluding to something else. And so some historians believe that this is actually meaning that there were men in the city who wanted to have sex with the angels. And so when it says they went after strange flesh, it's because the angels didn't have flesh as we understand it. It was different, which is why it was strange. And in the book of Jubilees, which is a book of scripture that is now considered apocryphal, it's stated that the women of Sodom also wanted to have sex with the angels. So it was contributing to this idea that you had all of these people in Sodom and Gomorrah who were going after the strange flesh, or angels who didn't have human flesh as we understand it. So now that we've talked about the verses that specifically condemn homosexuality, we have a couple of honorable mentions that we wanted to bring up here as well that often come up during this conversation. The first is Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. I'm sure you've heard this before. If we look at this portion in the Bible, in Genesis 2:18, it says it was not good that man should be alone. In reference to Adam, it said that man shouldn't be alone. And one writer wrote, notice that Eve is not the first solution God attempts to the problem of Adam's aloneness. God first presents Adam with every animal in the world, but none suffices. Only human companionship solves the existential problem of aloneness. Eve is not creative in this narrative to make children with Adam. This story is about loneliness and love, not procreation and progeny. So that's important to note that Eve was created not so that Adam and Eve could have babies, but so that Adam wouldn't be alone anymore. People often use this example to say, "Oh, marriage has to be between a man and a woman then, because God created Adam and Eve." But this is actually an ad ignorantium argument. Basically, that's a logical fallacy that makes an argument based on assumptions, based on what was not said, but nothing is explicitly said, so the argument is faulty. So, for example, it's like saying, since the Bible does not actively support homosexuality, it must condemn it. If we were to put this in a more modern context, or put this in another way to help us understand, it would be like if you've heard a friend speak enthusiastically about his sister, but you've never heard him talk about a brother. So you conclude that he either doesn't have a brother or that he must dislike him. How valid is your conclusion? Obviously, we would say it's not valid because you're basing everything you know, or you're basing this conclusion about things that you don't know. So it's the same thing that's happening here. Even though homosexuality isn't directly addressed, because homosexuality isn't directly addressed in this story, it's not fair to make a condemnation of it. So just as the creation story does not mention mere cats and ferrets, but only mammals in general, so too does it not discuss every permutation of human sexuality. And as a small nation surrounded by larger, more populous ones, the Israelites were greatly concerned with procreation and population growth. So naturally, the Bible puts forth being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth with human beings as the ideal condition. So even though we've heard Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, the Bible says that Eve was created to help out with Adam's aloneness and not to create children. That isn't mentioned. And then we can't base an argument off of assumptions when those assumptions are not clearly stated in the text. Another honorable mention is 1 Corinthians 11:11, which says, "Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God." People use this verse to say, oh, men and women are incomplete without each other, therefore they have to enter into a marriage relationship, and anything other than that must be condemned. In these verses, in this chapter, it's actually explaining that men and women need each other in a broad human sense, but it doesn't say that every individual has to be in a male-female relationship for marriage. This whole chapter is about hair and head coverings. And so instead of reinforcing rigid gender roles, it's almost like Paul is saying, hey, don't take this too far. Men and women actually depend on each other, right? Neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man. We have these expectations, but we need each other. So using it as a universal statement about sexual relationships is actually pulling it out of context when that wasn't the intent at all. The chapter doesn't talk anywhere about marriage definitions or sexual orientation, so it would be unfair and unjust to the text to say that these phrases are condemning homosexuality. We actually see what might be an example of homosexuality in the Bible. Some historians and researchers are torn and they kind of go back and forth, but let's just see what the text says itself and then we'll form our own conclusion. In 1 Samuel 18, it talks about Jonathan and David. And in 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, it says, "The soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." And then in verse 3, the two men make a covenant with each other because they loved each other as their own souls. And then in verse 14, Jonathan strips himself naked and then gives David everything that he's wearing and everything that he has. In 1 Samuel 20, it's talking about Saul being angry with Jonathan, his son. And he says, "Thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness." The Hebrew of this verse is kind of ambiguous. And so the translation could actually be rendered as saying, "Do I not know that you are an intimate companion to the son of Jesse?" And in fact, in the New International Version of the Bible, shame is actually used here instead of confusion. So it says that, I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own shame and unto the shame of thy mother's nakedness. And given that the words shame and nakedness are common biblical ways of talking about sex, some scholars believe that Saul is actually condemning Jonathan for having a sexual relationship with David. And then in 1 Samuel 20, a few verses later, in verse 42, it talks about David meeting up with Jonathan, and it says they kissed one another and they wept with one another. And then finally, in 2 Samuel 1, it says, I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant thou hast been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. There are many different ways that we can interpret that, but if modern day I were to say that a man loved me and his love was better than the love of women, there's only so many ways that you can take that. So whether or not this verse is specifically alluding to a homosexual relationship, we don't know for sure, but it seems like there's a possibility that it might. So this concludes our look at the sources and what they say about homosexuality. Once again, I want to reiterate that there was nothing mentioned in the Book of Mormon, nothing mentioned in the Doctrine and Covenants. This all came from the Bible. And if we look at the verses in relation to their context and the actual Greek words that they were translated from, then it doesn't seem like what we understand as homosexuality is actually condemned. Loving, committed, monogamous same-sex relationships are not addressed anywhere. Usually what's being addressed is idolatry and prostitution. So with all that being said, we are going to look in this next video about what modern day sources have said. Buckle up, this gets juicy.